Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Everyone who is cold or very cold. Welcome to this ArchivesSpace Basics training. I'm Rachel Searcy, and I'm the accessioning archivist at New York University. And I'm here today with my co-trainers, Jody and Dan, and I will let them introduce themselves now.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, I'm Jody at Montana State University Library.
I'm Dan Michelson. I'm the collections archivist at Smith College here in Northampton, Massachusetts.
And we're also joined today by three trainers in training, Susanna, Regina, and Kevin. And so you will see them in the chat and the Q&A helping us out with that. So while I share some housekeeping information, if you just joined in the chat, people are introducing themselves. So your name, your institution, and what the weather is like where you are right now. In advance of this training, you received an email with the agenda and links to all of the materials you'll need to participate in this workshop and to continue learning after the training is over. At the top of the agenda, you'll see a link called Course Materials, which includes the Quick Start Guide for this course, which has links and resources for the topics that we are covering today. Could I ask if one of my co-trainers could put the link to that in the chat right now? We may not stick exactly to the agenda, but we will take the planned break at the appropriate time. We're using Zoom webinar for this training, and your microphone and camera are both muted. If you'd like to ask questions, we ask that you use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. And putting your questions in the Q&A just helps us make sure that we don't miss your questions, as sometimes things that are said in the chat can get lost in the shuffle, and we don't want that to happen. But if you have a general question or need some form of assistance, please feel free to reach out in the chat. Some of the questions will be read and answered during the allocated Q&A time, but we also might just type the answers directly into the Q&A, so be sure to refer to that because there may be some additional information for you there. We are using the latest version of ArchivesSpace for this training, which is version 4.0.0. If you're using an earlier version of ArchivesSpace at your organization, just keep in mind that some of the features that you see today may not be available or may look a little bit different when you're at home. We won't be able to troubleshoot issues with your own implementation of ArchivesSpace at your organization. But if you are having troubles on that front, please feel free to email archivespacehome@lyrasis.org. And if someone could put that in the chat, I'd appreciate that. Finally, please keep in mind that there are many participants in this workshop from a variety of institutions with varied experience levels. Remember that the ArchivesSpace Code of Conduct applies to all ArchivesSpace events, including this one. So please remember to be considerate and respectful in your interactions with your fellow participants, Jody, Dan, and myself in the Q&A in the chat. This training is going to provide a basic overview of the ArchivesSpace application, primarily the staff user interface. After that, we're going to explore two of the primary record types that you can create in ArchivesSpace, accession records and resource records. And we'll also dig a bit into instances and top containers. And we look forward to talking with you today about all of those areas. I want to mention that most of the examples we are using today are real collections held by ArchivesSpace member organizations. These organizations have made their metadata available to the program for the purposes of education and training, and in the interest of creating a more diverse set of example data. So we're very grateful for that. Before we get into the training proper, I'd just like to introduce myself a little more fully. I'm Rachel Searcy, and I've been involved in ArchivesSpace for about 9 years now. At NYU, I worked on our migration from Archivist Toolkit to ArchivesSpace, and I also act as our primary administrator. I've served on the ArchivesSpace Advisory Council, and I'm the immediate past chair of the Technical Advisory Council. I've been working in academic archives for the past 13 years, so most of my references and examples are going to be informed by that perspective. So if I say something that doesn't match your process, please feel free to ask for clarity. We all know that there are many different processes, workflows, and use cases in archives, and that is true in ArchivesSpace as well. So with all of that housekeeping and introductory business out of the way, I'm going to hand things over to Jody, who will get us going.
All right, thank you, Rachel. I am just going to get all of my screens rearranged, which will take just a moment here. While I'm doing that, and to give you a little more of an introduction to myself. In a previous life, I was a program manager at the Orbis Cascade Alliance, where I supported a 28 institution implementation of ArchivesSpace. So I was doing that with no ArchivesSpace experience myself, and depending on wonderfully skilled groups of people who were implementing. But a big piece of what we did there was to boil down a really complicated application for a real variety of institutions, from some of the largest in the region to some of the very smallest with part-time staff. So you will see that reflected in both my my overview of this and in how I introduce what we call implementation choices. Are you actually seeing my screen? Can someone confirm?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, it does not have the little green line around it. So, all right, so I am going to start with the staff interface. And for this part, I'm just going to go ahead and use my own instance of ArchivesSpace. So I got to go from overseeing and supporting implementations at a consortium to implementing at an institution, which is it's a interesting variety of experience to have. So if we kind of start with our, we're going to go clockwise around this screen. You can have multiple repositories in ArchivesSpace. In our case, our main one is our manuscript collections. CPINES is our training space. I take new and people with change responsibilities through the same training that we've developed and that others have developed. So that's the practice space. And then we did have our university archives in a separate space. We ultimately ended up merging those, but this is the main one that we work in most of the time. And I'm going to talk a little bit in implementation choices about some of the ways that you might think about whether you have more than one repository. There are some very particular decision points that are wise to keep in mind. In the system piece, this is where you manage a lot of different aspects of your instance. The controlled value lists are all the things that appear on your drop-down menus. So if we look at that, all the different types of options that you have, and I'm going to show you a little later how you can put in default values or say, here's the thing that we use most of the time. And that's a handy thing to do. Container and location profiles are if you're using that detailed information for managing your containers and locations. Again, we'll talk about where that might or might not be useful to you. Managing repositories is where that's where you give yourself that drop-down list. OAI PMH settings, if you're harvesting to an aggregator or somewhere else, that's where you would do that. Managing users is where you assign user permission levels. This is if you are managing a repository where you have a variety of people from a department head to student assistants who all need different kinds of permissions. That is where you do that. This drop down associated with my username is where you can set preferences, and I'll go a little bit more over that later. That's how you can affect how your screen, how your menus look. If you are doing user management, becoming a user is a very handy little function. So for instance, when I set up a new student assistant account, I can quickly log out of this, become them, and confirm that the permissions that I set are indeed the ones that I intended them to have. Another settings piece is managing groups and user access. Managing top containers. This is one you use a lot because that's where you can search using all kinds of different attributes of your containers, their locations, whether they're resource or accessions. You can manage things, whether you've exported them to the ILS if you're going to use that capability. Lots of handy little functions there. But it's going to show me which repository I'm in. One of the things that becomes crucial if you have more than one repository is making sure that you are working in the right one. Otherwise, you will be unhappy. All right, search is just what it sounds like. This is a general text search. You can also do more detailed or fielded search if you need that. So this is, as you're managing work, as you're cleaning up metadata, these are functions that you are likely to use. This is, if you browse, this is a list of all the different types of records that you can create and manage. I'm going to go over all that in a minute. And this is where you can create those things. Now, if we look at the public interface, my ArchivesSpace instance, we have actually turned off the public interface because we publish everything to our ILS, Archives West, and JSTOR. So in order to show you the public interface, I need to go to this instance, which has logged itself out. That's fun. Bear with me a moment, please. This is a thing that Google Docs is doing to me. I guess I am going to come back around to that at the end. Okay, we are going to go back to the MSU ArchivesSpace. And I will somehow get back to that. So if you're going to, we're going to look at next at how ArchivesSpace can interact with other systems, because there's broadly a couple of ways that you can use it. You can use it as its own universe where you're doing all the management in the staff interface and you use the public interface as just that. There's certainly no requirement that your ArchivesSpace instance interact with any other systems, but that is one of the questions that you'll need to ask in implementation choices. So if we start with one of our major collections, the Ivan Doig papers, and hope that the search function decides to work well. Okay, so we're going to just look for the resource record for the Ivan Doig papers. And that's that. So if we look at There's a reason they ordered me a new computer. If we look at the full resource record, this is a really big collection, and it's got a particularly special attribute, which is that we digitized everything in this collection. So for each component level record, so each folder, we've got both a physical folder and a digital object. So when we export the Ivan Doig papers to Archives West, this is what we get. We've got a full finding aid with digital objects for each one. Now we might come to that through our library catalog, Ivan Doig. The finding aids are linked, so that's going to the same place. But again, in each case, so here's that 1974 diary, we've got a link. So that's a really important part of the digital object part of ArchivesSpace. The digital object module is not a full digital asset management system. This use case, where you're going from a finding aid or any other record to a digital object, was basically the use case that I had in mind when the system was developed. So it's both a very useful thing. I mean, the puzzle of how you tie together collection level description and items is a really thorny and largely unsolved one in our world. But this is one way that ArchivesSpace can address that particular one. So that's one of the things that you can end up with resource records, with exporting a MARC XML record, exporting to an EAD in whatever form of EAD you use, to an aggregator or whatever your EADs might appear in, and then having those digital objects, which ultimately show up as a digital collection. And if we look at that on JSTOR, we can find this same item, maybe. Yeah, there's that same diary. So this is all managed by and output by ArchivesSpace and the way that we've implemented it. Many of these things came along before we implemented ArchivesSpace. So we've both done things from the front end, and then we've gone ahead with some aspects of how we present the Ivan Doig papers, and then also ingested and reworked a number of things. Okay, so that takes us to the different modules for ArchivesSpace. If we go back to home, the first thing that you find on this browse list are the first types. These are the primary types that describe the collections. First, we describe the stuff. All of these other things, the reason they're presented in a separate section is these are the helper records, the things that tie it all together, the things that are going to enable better discovery, where you can be most closely linked to things like control vocabularies, and a real advantage in all of this. Accessions are they're just what they sound like. Rachel will be introducing accessions in much more detail. But that's that initial intake description where we gain that intellectual and physical control. And this is not going to go there. So I'm just going to describe it. There they are. Okay. And I'm going to take you to a more recent accession. So this is the very most recent thing we acquired. We're working on our College M. So it's got those basic pieces of information. If we go to resources, we already saw that for the Ivan Doig collection. So we've seen what that is. And then digital objects. Actually, if we go back to going to do something a little bit different with Ivan Doig, because Doig also has, besides all those individual digital objects, it also has a web archive associated with it. And so we have added that as a digital object. So this is archived at Archivit. This is the personal website with all of the book group guides and whatever. And so his widow was able to stop paying to host that. The other piece that you have here is the physical control of just where everything is located. By going to locations, I can literally browse all of our shelves. I might do this to see where we've got shelf space. I might do this to figure out just a number of space management functions. And you can narrow this down by a number of other things. We already looked at the digital objects. Okay. I was going to switch to the training instance to look at agents and subjects, but since I can't do that right now, I'm going to show you our subjects and agents. This is where we can engage with the need to not shame each other over metadata. There's some of our metadata is not perfectly in order because we all have metadata that's not perfectly in order. So that's just a fact that all of us deal with. So I will just be transparent about that. I don't know why some of these things appear here. They came in as imports. So that's the way that is. So this is where we have subject headings from various sources, various types of terms. And this is one of the places where, again, if you're exporting to other places, if you're drawing on those recognized thesauri, that's going to make those exports easier. Likewise, for agents, some things appear, software appears. So ArchivesSpace is always going to be in your agent records. Don't take it out because it's doing things. But you have persons, corporate entities, and families here. You might be drawing on a variety of sources, and you are able to draw on a number of rules. Again, when your collections are interacting with a larger universe, and it's always a good idea to think about that. Up to you, of course, but your collections can go places more easily if you've tied into some of these functions. Absolutely not required, of course. I'm going to talk about that more later. Events. Events is something that we don't actually use very much. All that shows up here is things being transferred out of the College of the Pines instance, and College of the Pines is imaginary. That just shows where we did training. Collection management, we do use. We have a list by processing status to allow us to see what's unprocessed, what's processed. And in some cases, we've got a processing priority only. Usually we've just got these. Then the last module is assessments. That is also a module that we don't use. But it is a powerful way to work on your collection management. Okay, a sip of coffee, and then we're going to talk about implementation choices. Okay, I am going to turn off screen sharing for just a moment while I get Google Drive to behave itself. All righty then. Okay, looks like we're back in business. At least we will be when I make this a real slideshow. There. So, you will all agree that I should not leave my day job to become a graphic designer, but I think it's often useful to have a mental picture of where things go from ArchivesSpace. So one of the basic reasons for using a system like ArchivesSpace is you can enter things once and reuse them many times. My favorite example of that is dates. If you put dates into an accession record, those dates can flow all the way out into the public user interface, into aggregation, into any number of outputs or connections. Having come into the field some time ago, the amount of time that we can otherwise waste re-entering data is something that I really celebrate getting beyond. You also have the ability to draw on these authority records for agents and subjects. And again, make that sharing out much smoother and much more relevant. One of the things that we struggle with as a field is being able to do things at scale. In Archive Grid, for example, they would love to be able to make subject slices, but our subject authorities aren't consistent enough across everything that's in Archive Grid. It's not currently possible. So that's a piece to keep in mind. But with implementation choices, this is often the question that we want to ask. How do I do this the right way? ArchivesSpace has all these different parts to it. It has assessments. Maybe that means I should use assessments. I should use all the things, not clean all the things, although this is related to cleaning. We confront entropy in this. And to invest our time well, we need to understand that there isn't a right way. There isn't a single way to do any of this. That's just like any other system that you implement, but it's a piece of knowledge that I think it's really important for everyone to have so that you can think through, because really you start with your goals. What do you need help with? Where you can make less work. So if the work can be done once and reused a number of times, if you can do the work better, if you can make some of your data entry more efficient, or have everybody use the same kind of rights statement or other kinds of text statements, so that when you have end users looking at what results, they get a lot of consistency. Your policies are clear. The name of your institution is in there the same every time. Having once run Archives West, very large aggregation, you would not believe how many different ways we as institution can enter our names. Another fairly simple thing that starts to have really big echo effects. You also need to think about where it could create more work. In showing you my embarrassing subject and agent records, that's an example of where we made more work for ourselves. So now we're doing some cleanup work, but we're also getting better authorities information, recording that information. In the long run, it's worthwhile. I would have done that differently. You saw we don't use the assessments module. We don't use container profiles or location profiles because we just don't really need those things. Maybe we would need them at some future point, and we can think about things in ways that will allow that. So these are some of the questions that you might ask. Who are the people? Please always start with the people, the patrons, the staff, both. So in our case, we're just using it as staff. We don't use that public interface. So we're really we're thinking very neutrally about where things appear, because they appear in many places from our outputs. What kind of institution are you? We're a mid-size public academic. You might be at a historical society or a government archive or any number of other places. You could be at a very well-resourced institution. You might be at a less well-resourced institution. What other systems do you already work with? Maybe you have something that works just fine or interacts better with the rest of your organization. If you're in a museum, there may be any number of systems that you share with object curators, and that may be okay. How many people do you have to do the work? And how many other things do they do? How big are your collections? Are they primarily analog, digital? Are they some of both? And then how complex is your inventory management? Do you have a lot of storage locations? Do you have just one? We have 5, so our inventory management is complex in some ways, not in others. So if we look at the example of the mythical Cedar Grove College, so this is a private liberal arts college, 1,200 students. The library has just 5 staff members. You'll notice that one staff member does all the metadata work for the library and oversees archives. So that's a pretty typical, for an institution of this type, pretty typical situation. There's some student workers who process collections and monitor the reading room. They're part of a consortium with a multi-institution ILS, and then there's a regional EAD aggregator and a DPLA hub. About 50 analog collections in a single storage location, and 20 of the collections are considered processed. Then they've got 1,000 digital objects in the DPLA hub. Most of those are described individually and don't have a collection context. So if we think of some of the questions that we asked in the previous slide, this is a small institution with very few staff, a small collection. We've got an ILS, an EAD aggregator, and a DPLA hub. And the inventory management just isn't very complex. So this is an institution that needs to do a kind of simple, stripped down version of an ArchivesSpace implementation. So they want to create basic level access with a really small staff. They want to do DAX compliant description, because of course we want to do DAX compliant description. Dan and I both served, I served, Dan still serves on the standards committee for SAA, and always ask, what's everybody's favorite standard? DAX. DAX is almost it's the prevailing favorite standard because it's important to have a favorite. So there's some existing accession records. I guess I didn't say that in the previous slide, but there are. So getting those DAX compliant and into ArchivesSpace means that you would be able to make them publicly available if you turn that on. But then you're going to be creating resource records, and you want the students to do good data entry, to be really consistent. as that the metadata person archivist oversees that. So then you just want those descriptions to flow smoothly into the ILS, the EAD aggregator, and DPLA. What's not a priority for Cedar Grove College? That detailed inventory, space, and location management. All the stuff is in one room. You may be able to just walk up to it and find it. Or you may want to do more detailed inventory control for other reasons, but may not be in the first implementation. Cedar Grove might not have the resources to do that in-depth work with agents and subjects. But since the archivist is also the metadata person, they might have just a lot of capabilities there or be able to do that. Assessments, maybe not an initial priority. So that's an example of a really stripped down implementation. I wanted to, I actually wrote out the implementation. So here's what the process might look like. Ingesting those accession records, spawning the resource records that enhance sufficiently, set up that student data entry in spreadsheets, make those accessions available in the public user interface, might use those collection management fields, don't really need locations, not. Now, why would I say no digital objects needed? Because that seems odd, doesn't it? I said they had digital objects that they're sending to the DPLA hub. One of the other things that I said is that the digital objects aren't necessarily connected with archival collections. This is a very typical situation for an institution of this type. You have, in our case, it's called the picture collection. It's kind of the catch-all collection. It doesn't really have a collection context. It's reflecting old practice where we separated photos and put them in their own place. So they've unfortunately lost collection context. They are described individually. So they don't connect to collections. And so it doesn't necessarily make sense to manage the metadata there. In this case, there's a DPLA hub that hosts the metadata and the digital objects. So that's about that. I sort of hit that hard because digital objects are often misunderstood. I have explained to many a library dean and director about that, that ArchivesSpace can't do all the things. And that's okay, just something important to understand. All right, I have left about 5 minutes for any questions or anything that anyone wants me to back up to. I am happy to do that. Well, we may be able to move on to our next topic a teeny bit early then.
Was that the topic being my stuff, or was there another area you were going to talk about, Jody?
That is all I have for the application overview.
Okay.
So we are running a little bit early in general.
Okay. Great.
We do have a question. Is there a linkage with name authorities such as LCSH and AAT? I think that is a question that I'm going to put to someone else because of the way that we are currently using ArchivesSpace. I don't think it's actually linked.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what they mean by linkage. If ArchivesSpace does support multiple different vocabularies, but if you're asking about like the ability to easily import directly, yeah, Kevin is mentioning in the
Thank
chat,
you.
like there is a specific plugin that supports some of that functionality. And I'm sure there's a video that maybe one of the trainers could try and dig up on the ArchivesSpace YouTube channel that might help explain that. But
You
that
bet.
would be my suggestion for next steps on that front. Okay,
Yes.
so it looks like we're maybe ready to move into accession records. So I will share my screen. Okay, so in this section, I want to introduce the functionality for accession records to you, show you what's available, and then talk about some potential use cases for the different fields, subrecords, and other pieces of functionality. I'm not going to be talking about how you do accessioning generally, like how you would make local decisions about accessioning at your institution, how you develop an accessioning workflow or program, or how even you would decide which fields you want to use consistently. But if you are keen for that kind of information, I'd strongly suggest that you check out the archival accessioning best practices, which I'm putting in the chat right now. This is a new archival standard. Maybe, Jody, some people might decide it's their favorite standard over DAX, or maybe you can have more than one favorite. I don't know. But this is a new archival standard that was approved by the Society of American Archivists in November of 2024. And it can help you with those day-to-day accessioning nuts and bolts and thinking about your workflows. It also has suggestions for accession record elements. So I'd like to think that this session today and the best practices are really complementary. I'd also, just before we get into accessioning in ArchivesSpace, read the definition of accessioning from the best practices. So it says, accessioning is the basis of all archival stewardship. It is a suite of activities through which archivists appraise, transfer, stabilize, and document archival acquisitions. Accessioning provides pathways to access, informs future decisions, and promotes sustained resource commitment for the care of archival materials. So I'd like you to just keep that definition in mind as we go through the different parts of the ArchivesSpace accession record. Accession records are used to document what you know about materials that come into your custody. So this could be a new collection, or it could be an accretion to a collection you've had for decades. And it could be a single item, like a scrapbook, for example, or it could be hundreds of boxes. But it's really important to do this work for all of those types of things that come across your desk. So we are going to go ahead and create an accession record. So there are a couple ways to do that. The easiest is to use the Create menu and select Accession. And this is going to open up a blank template for you to create an accession record. There's another way that you can create accession records. If you, for example, were browsing the accession records in your database, you can see at the top, there's this button called Create Accession. So you can do it there too. But I'm going back to this template. It has many fields and it might seem overwhelming at first, but just know that you don't have to put information into each of these fields or areas. In fact, accession records require very little from a system point of view. But again, I'd recommend, if you want more guidance on like field usage, to check out the best practices. But just as a heads up, it's important to know that that standard was written to be system agnostic, so it is not tailored specifically to ArchivesSpace. For now, all that you need to save an accession record is to have an identifier. that's it. So I'm going to create one now. And you can see that there's 4 boxes. One of them is in white and the other are grayed out. You don't have to use all 4 of these boxes, nor do you have to use any sort of set format or standard for your identifier. You could put all of the information in the first box and be done with it. You could use all of them, it's up to you. But you might notice that as I put information into one box, the box immediately after it suddenly becomes available to me. So now these first 2 are white and only 2 are gray. So I'm just gonna kind of use a set format that I tend to use, which is the year to 3 to 4 digits, and then just a sequential number. But yeah, just strive to be consistent in the way that you apply this across the board and follow your internal practices. But you'll notice that if anything is required in ArchivesSpace, you'll see a red asterisk. So that's why the identifier has a red asterisk there. So that means that that information is required to save the record. So we're going to hit save. And if you have supplied or created all of the required information, your record will be saved and you will get a green box that tells you that your record was created or saved. If I had not supplied it with the required information, that box would be red, and you would get some kind of error message that would tell you what it is you were missing. But even though this is all ArchivesSpace needs, we want to add more information here in order for this to be a useful and a meaningful accession record. So you probably want something like a title or a date, but again, that would be up to you. But instead of building this out in real time, because that's sort of difficult to talk while doing it, I'm going to show you an existing accession record, just because I think it's a little bit easier to see with examples. And I'm opening it up in the edit mode because I think that also shows you, the fields that I've used and the fields that I haven't used. So this is a completed accession record for the Tomi Arai and Ligon Wong papers. And this is admittedly probably more comprehensive than many institutions might do, but I sort of augmented it because I wanted to show you sort of like the universe that is available to you. So you can see that we have an identifier and that they've also included a bit more information. We have an accession date, which is the date that the materials arrived. And then this publish checkbox is unchecked. So this refers to whether the record can be viewable in the public user interface. So if, for example, your organization wants to make your accession records available and uses the PUI, you'd want to ensure that that publish checkbox is checked. And that's true for all record types, in fact. So just keep in mind that for material that you want to show up in the public user interface, it's sort of opt-in. And there are ways to set your preferences so that any newly created record will automatically be set to publish. So if that's a consideration for you, just know that there are ways for you to tailor the system to help you in that regard. Some other basic information you might want to include in an accession record includes the content description, so a summary of the materials that you have. You might also want to use the condition description field to flag if there's anything like a preservation concern or something that might need treatment. Keep in mind that as you're recording information, that you can repurpose a lot of this information down the line in other forms, and we'll get to that at the end of this session. So I just kind of want to walk through a few more of the fields in this top basic information section of the record. So disposition, that refers to what happened to these materials. So Here we get information about a new collection being created, but also that some materials were appraised out and returned to the donor. If there's an inventory somewhere, like maybe the donor provided you one along with the acquisition, you could indicate the existence of that and also say where it lives. Provenance is very important to record who donated it and when. And I'm going to skip ahead because some of these are pretty self-explanatory, like the language and the script. But you can also indicate if there's any, what the access restrictions are, if there are any, and also use this use restriction note field to convey information about intellectual property. And if it's helpful, there's a combination of sort of like, I guess, radial buttons or checkboxes and free text fields that kind of allow you to use this in a way that is the most helpful to you and conveys your information in the most appropriate way. Language is not required, but if that's something that would be helpful to you, you can use this language subrecord note. Before I get deep down into the rest of the possibilities for an accession record, I just want to point out on the left-hand side of the screen here where my mouse is kind of hovering is a way for you to navigate around the record. You could definitely scroll top to bottom to get where you want to go. But if you want to jump directly to a certain section, like say, I want to go directly to the subjects, I can just click here and it will bring me directly to it. And again, if you want to go back to the top, you can always click basic information. You'll also notice that as I move throughout the application, whenever I'm hovering or stopping over a label for a field, you get these little helpful notes. So these are included within the ArchivesSpace application. And the tooltips are associated with almost all of the labels in ArchivesSpace. So you just hover over, I'm hovering over the title label right now, and you'll get a definition of whatever that element is, including usually a rule to DAX if there's a corresponding DAX rule. If you're an organization that doesn't use DAX, for example, maybe use a different content standard, these rollover tooltips are customizable. So you can refer to a different standard if you would like. So yeah, again, they're customizable, but they are very helpful in helping you determine what a particular field is and deciding whether or not to use it. So you might, for example, ask yourself, what is retention rule and why or should I use it? The tooltips can be really helpful in that regard. These basic information fields are specific to accession records. So you are not going to see these in resource records, for example, or digital object records. Another way that you can describe your materials in an accession is to use what are called subrecords that will show up in other record types. So you can use these subrecords to further describe your materials. So you can use them to, include dates, say how much material you have. This language record, subrecord is a subrecord. So I'm going to show you what a few of these are. So, and I saw a question about this in the chat about why is there a red asterisk for language when I said that the only requirement for an accession record is language. So a language subrecord is not required for an accession, but if I add this subrecord, there are required parts to, save the valid subrecord. So I can't have a language subrecord without including the language, for example. But if I wanted to, I could get rid of this language subrecord entirely. I hope that makes sense, but we can always come back to that. We are going to move down to dates. So it's helpful to know what your material covers. So we have a date record applied. And you can see that once you add a date subrecord, there are certain things that are required. There's a label that is required and a type. And those are the fields indicated in red asterisks. You'll also see a gray asterisk right here under the date expression. And I'm sorry that one of these tooltips is won't go away. I don't know what to do about that, so apologies for that. But this gray asterisk means that something is conditionally required. So that means that in order to save the record, I need to either provide information here in the date expression field where there's the gray asterisk, or in another record, in another part of the record. So I either need these begin and end dates, or I need a date expression. I need to have one. That's what that means. So we can see in this date subrecord that the person has used both the machine readable begin and end dates and this date expression field. The date expression field is sort of human readable and easy for people to understand, whereas the begin and end dates are good for machines and computers. And so if you use some kind of discovery layer that allows for date filtering, like those usually require these begin and end dates. Most subrecords are repeatable. So there's one date record right now, and we can see that the earliest item is from 1937 and the most recent item is from 2010. But let's say that the majority of material in this accession is from the 70s to the 90s. So if we wanted to, we could add a second date subrecord, and I'm going to do that by clicking this plus button. And for the type, I'm going to say bulk dates. So I'm just going to say like 1980 to 1999. And so those can be really helpful in just kind of adding more nuance and conveying the realities of your material. We also see a few extent statements in this accession. Again, it's not required, but it is good practice to know how much of something that you have. Once that subrecord is opened, all of these fields that have the red asterisk are required. So to include an extent, you want to designate whether it's the entirety of the accession or just a part. That's what this portion field means. So we can see here that the entirety of the accession is 35 linear feet. They've included a container summary to give more information about the types of containers. And then this should actually be part. And then they have these other extent statements that are more specific. So we have an extent statement about one VHS cassette, and we also have an extent statement about digital material. This is totally optional, and this is, one of those local decisions you'd want to make of whether this is something you do, and if so, how. But it can be really useful in terms of clarifying what you have and also planning for future work. Just thinking about a 10 linear foot collection that's unprocessed, you might envision it taking a certain amount of time. But what if you didn't know that there was also, 3 terabytes of digital materials? Like that would change your understanding of the collection and probably how much time it would take. So it's helpful to include this information at this point. You also have the ability to associate agents and subjects with your accession. So if there's a lot of these agent or subject records, you might come to this section and then see this, please click to load records. And then in parentheses, it would tell you how many records. So if you have a lot, it's just kind of saving performance by not immediately loading them. And we're not going to go into these record types in specific today, but if the agent or subject already exists, you can either type ahead for it or browse. So I'm just going to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to say I'm adding another agent, and you can specify what their relationship to the accession is. Maybe they are the creator, maybe they're the source, or maybe they're just documented in it. So let's say they are a subject, and I think this was already linked, but just if I'm looking for the Godzilla Artist Collective, I can type ahead for it and it might show up. I can browse for it, which I do by clicking this arrow and selecting browse. Or if it's an entity not already in your system, you can create it right here and it will automatically link it. So subjects work the same way in this regard. So if I've created, excuse me, if I've opened either an agent or a subject little subrecord or a subrecord, and I decide I don't want it, I don't want to leave it empty because, you know, this red asterisk is required. And if I try and save this, I'll get an error. So if you if you open up something and don't need it anymore, you just click this X and then click confirm removal, and that'll get rid of it. You can link your accession to a resource record. So this related resources is what I'm talking about. But you can only do that if the resource record already exists in your system. So again, the way you would do that is either the type ahead or the browse, just like I showed. And we'll talk about in a moment what you might want to do if you're accessing a new collection that doesn't already have a resource record. And we can see when we look at this related resource that it is dark blue, as are the linked agents and, and the subjects. So when you see a blue record like this means that that's a record unto itself that we can then open up. So let's just look at this Lower East Side print shop, which is an agent record. And that has its own record. So that's what those blue records mean. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about some of these other subrecords and how you might use them, but I'm not going to go over each and every one exhaustively. External documents, this is a place that you can provide a kind of pointer to another place that you have information that might be helpful. So you might want to link it to a digital collection file, for example, or an inventory that lives somewhere. You're not uploading these documents to ArchivesSpace, but you're just sort of using this subrecord to point to where they live. You might want to use this right statement field if you wanted to convey really particular information about like copyright or licensing, for example. There's a lot of options here to do that. This metadata rights declaration, again, this is something that you might want to do. I know some institutions do a sort of like blanket statement for all of their metadata in kind of like one single place, and others like to do it record by record. So that's really up to you. Instances, we will talk about instances later, but if you wanted to link boxes or other other containers to your accession records, you can do that here. You can do a deaccession subrecord. So let's say, for example, that there was artwork in this collection, like actual artwork, and we're not keeping those. So you could create a deaccession subrecord to say like original artwork returned to donor. You could be pretty expansive about this or not. Again, like come up with some internal mechanisms, and then the date would be when you acted upon this. So let's say we did this at the end of the year. And you could also add an extent if you want about like how much you deaccessioned. So that is something one can do. Jody already mentioned this collection management subrecord. If you wanted to use that to kind of help you with your processing, prioritization, or planning, you could do that. Classifications we won't get into today, but if you use them, you can add them here. And then the sort of catch-all of user-defined fields is always available to you at the end. So I did make a few changes here, so let's save our accession and hope that we don't have error messages, although if we do, that will be instructive. So I'm gonna attempt to save, and everything looked good, so I get this lovely green message at the top indicating that all of my changes have been successful. So we are gonna finish the accession records off by talking about what you can do after you've already done this. So I've mentioned a few times that there is a lot of value in creating kind of a robust accession record with all of the information you know, because it can be useful down the line. So we are gonna talk about how you can do that. And so we're going to talk about this feature called spawning. And so if you are at the top of your accession record in this menu bar, you'll see spawn with a few different options. And basically what all of these do is take your accession record and turn it into something else that you can then kind of tweak. So you can say, use this as the basis for another accession record, or create a resource record off of this, or you can even create an archival object in an existing resource record. So we're going to show you kind of how those work and use cases for them. An important thing to remember as I show you these options is that when you spawn a new record, it isn't truly saved until you actually save it and confirm it. So just remember that. And there's information in the Help Center about, which specific fields from your accession record carry over in all these different ways. So the first thing I'm going to show you is spawning an accession record into another accession record. And I use this a lot. This is really useful when you have accretions to existing collections where a lot of stuff is the same. So maybe it's the same donor, specifically, maybe the content is really similar, a lot of the same subjects. It's really helpful to not have to start from scratch all over again. And especially if those materials are kind of homogeneous, maybe it's, records from a specific department where they're pretty similar, or, a donor that you're kind of on a regular schedule with for accruals, this can be really useful. So I'm just going to say spawn an accession record from this accession record. And again, this has not been saved yet. This is what that blue bar up here is describing. And what you want to do is sort of like review what you have here and then tweak it to suit your needs. So I will create a new identifier for it. Let's say it's 2025, I don't know, 333. We're going to update the date because it came in recently. And then I want to revise this description because this is describing the initial donation, which was quite comprehensive. And maybe this accretion is much smaller and doesn't include all of this. So let's just say it's primarily, exhibition catalogs and ephemera. I might want to get rid of, everything below here because it doesn't apply. And I'm doing this very quickly. You would probably want to spend more time evaluating and editing this description, but that's just an example. Maybe there's no AV in this and there's no mold, and that doesn't apply. And then instead of, the initial disposition, which said we were creating a new collection, I'm just going to say what is happening to this material now. So I'm going to say it's an accretion to this collection as boxes 20 to 23, for example. And I'm going to get rid of this old stuff. And I'm going to update the date. Oops. But a lot of this stuff is the same. So, we're working off the same deed agreement, which has the same copyright considerations. Uh, you know, maybe the dates are different in that they're, I am just making this up to be perfectly frank, but hopefully you get the idea. And then, the extent is carrying over, but we're just going to pretend that this is a much smaller accretion. And I'm going to get rid of these AV and born digital extents, but maybe all of these agents are still the same. They may be, and all of these subjects still apply. So, that is a lot easier for me than having to create this accession record from nothing. So, I'm happy with this hypothetical new accession, so I'm going to save it. And that saved me a lot of time, and I didn't have to re-enter everything. And so now this is an accretion to an existing collection. Maybe what I want to do next is update our resource record for this collection to include this information. So one way I can do that is to say spawn archival object. And this only works if your resource record already exists, but in our case it does. And it's this last one, this Tomi Arai and Li and Wang papers. So I'm selecting that resource record. And then now it is asking me, where in the resource record do you want to put this new stuff? And there is a tutorial video on this, so if you don't catch it the first time, you can always come back to it. So let's say, for example, I want to create a new series for all of this stuff. So I'm going to click at the bottom and say insert spawned component after, but I could put it nested underneath or before if I wanted to. And then it gives me a preview of where it will go. So I'm happy with this. So I'm going to say yes, select component position. And so what this is doing is it's bringing me up a template for the archival object it's going to create based on my accession record, and I can change it. So let's say instead, I don't want the title to be the collection title. I want to say that this is series, I think it's 5, and I'm just going to call it this 2020 accretion. And I'm going to say it's a series. And you may or may not want all of these subrecords at the series level. That's sort of up to you. But I like that there's a date. I like that there's an extent statement. I may, elect to remove these agent and subject links because we personally at my institution tend to not do that at that level, but you could. But I want to keep this what is now a series level scope note that is comes from my content description field because I think it's helpful to do that. So again, that just makes it easier for me. I don't have to do that myself. It already comes over. And I could add more here if I wanted to, but I'm happy as is, at least for the purposes of saving now. So I'm going to do that. And you can see, if you go kind of in this top window that shows you kind of the hierarchy of your series, that it's created a new series for me. So that's really useful. It's saving time, and I don't have to do it all again. We are going to actually stop here, and when we pick up after the break, we are going to talk about how you spawn an accession record into a resource record, because that's kind of a nice transition from talking about accessions to talking about resources. But since we are good on time, before we take a break, I'm just wondering if there's any questions about accession records specifically that it would make sense to answer before we take a break. I saw the chat was going wildly. Um, Okay, it seems like things have been answered in chat and in the Q&A. Okay, Jody, if you have instances attached to an accession and spawn an archivable object, do the instances carry through? Not currently. I know that there is a ticket for a feature request that someone had proposed, asking for this functionality, but I think it is still in the discussion phase as to if that's something people want, how, or if it could be configured, because there's a few different options. So at the break, I can actually find that ticket and share it with folks. But currently, instances in an accession record do not carry over into either a spawned resource record or a spawned digital or a spawned archival object. Okay. I'll maybe just pause for one more moment, and if any of the co-trainers who have been answering questions want to surface something that's already been answered, please feel free to do so. Okay, it doesn't seem like it, but we can always return to it in the Q&A. So what we're gonna do now is take a 15-minute break. So that means that we will return at 1:33 or 33 minutes after the hour, depending on your time zone. I do not want to do time zone math live for you all, but we will return. Let's make it 35 minutes after the hour since we're really good on time. So please feel free to take a moment for yourselves, and we'll return at 35 minutes after. All right, thank you for returning. Jody, are you ready to get into resource records?
I am just about ready.
Okay.
I am first making sure that everything actually works on my screen. All righty. Amazing how sometimes two screens still isn't enough. All right, so we are back in ArchivesSpace, and I'm going to pick up where Rachel left off, with the same accession record. So to begin creating a resource record, you're in the staff interface of your ArchivesSpace instance. If you have access to multiple repositories, you're going to make sure that you are in the correct one. So I'm going to operate with a couple of assumptions, which is that we're going to spawn a resource record from an accession record. So Rachel showed you two super useful use cases for spawning an accession from an accession or an archivable object from an accession. So I'm going to do the maybe more common, maybe not common workflow of creating a resource record from an accession. I'm also going to assume that we are going to make this record DAX compliant, that it's going to have all the elements of a DAX compliant record. That doesn't mean that that's the only way to do this, or, Rachel has already mentioned there are other standards that your repository may use. It does not matter, just use a standard and know what it is and refer to it. But there are a couple of things to realize for a minimal level collection description. And where you actually deal with these things in ArchivesSpace. So the reference code and name and location of repository is in your repository record. If you look at that repository record, all of the things, oh, well, that's a fun thing. All of the things that you would expect to see for that, the reference code, the name and location of your repository are in that record. So it's when you look at something in the public user interface or export it to another space that those things actually show up. They don't show up in the actual resource record. But what we do have is title, date, extent, name of creator, scope and content, conditions governing access, and languages and scripts of the materials. Those are all part of a DAX compliant resource record. The identification of the whole part relationship is that hierarchical description, which when Dan shows you all about creating multi-level description, that's what that's accounting for. So we're going to start by going to the accession record for the Tomi Are and Ligan Wong papers. We'll choose edit. And then we will choose spawn and resource record. But before I actually do that, let's take a quick tour again of this accession record, probably pretty fresh in your mind, and all of the elements that it has, because one of the things that is useful to understand is what flows through from the accession record and what doesn't, because there are elements that do and don't. And there's some workflow assumptions built in here that you should be aware of. So this has lots of DAX compliant elements. The content description is the beginning of a scope and content note. We know from DAX and from the accessioning standard that a minimal level scope and content note is a really great thing to have on your accession records. We have some condition description, the disposition, again, this is some of these collection management things, the location of the inventory, the provenance. And then we've noted both access and use restrictions. This is also a very multilingual collection, so it has lots of languages noted in it. English, Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. Creation dates. And in this case, I've done both a date expression and those machine mutable dates. Again, no right way to do that. When things move through systems, it can be beneficial to have both. And then just like as you saw before, it's got 3 parts to the different extents. It's got some attached agents, both the creator and then the donor. And then a few subject terms. These are institutions, that is, as agents. And then just topical subject terms. We've put a metadata rights declaration on this. And then I've attached 3 instances. Yes, I know this collection actually has 70 boxes, but that was too much work to do. So let's hold all of those elements in our mind, and then let's go ahead and spawn that resource record. Okay, so we're going to start by noting which things carried through from the accession records and which did not. So the title carried through. The identifier actually didn't. And this is one place that we can all differ a lot in our practices. Some of us carry the same number through from accession to collection. Some of us don't, which is one way to deal with a resource record that represents multiple accessions. Again, there's no right way to do this, but it means that it doesn't automatically spawn on through, that you're going to have to assign a collection number. So in this case, I will give it that. The level of description also doesn't carry through. And as you saw Rachel spawn off that archival object record, you can think about why that wouldn't spawn through, but where you may be changing your level of description in the process of creating a resource record. And then the restrictions apply did not carry through as a checkbox. Or in other places. So that represents, you're going to look at restrictions between accessioning and actually processing a collection, and figuring out how those apply in the present. It might be that something was closed while it was unprocessed. Now it's open, you're processing it, and so the restrictions no longer apply. In this case, there were both use and access restrictions. So we're going to relook at those in the accession record and figure out where they apply. All of our language stuff carried through. So the 4 languages as normalized forms, as well as that text note for the language of materials. The dates also carried through in both the expression and the machine readable forms. The 35 linear feet of the collection in the 70 manuscript boxes also carried through, as did the 1 video cassette and the gigabytes. But the instances that I assigned to the accession did not carry through. I had 2 boxes and that 1 video cassette. Again, what's the assumption here? The assumption is when something is accessioned, we gain that basic physical and intellectual control, and then we put it on a shelf, and it goes in a processing queue, or it goes in our planning documents. We might use the collection management fields in ArchivesSpace to do that planning, but generally we've always got some kind of queue of upcoming projects. At the time that we actually work on a collection, we get it back out of wherever we keep it in storage and do things to it that often include rehousing, different box numbers, digitization. We do all kinds of things in order to make it fully ready for use by researchers. So to have those instances carry through is often not going to apply. It might. And in that case, we put new instances in, but it does not carry through. And that is a piece to understand. It also means if you have noted on an accession a digital object instance, as we do when we do born digital accessions, we add the note of where those are as a digital object. That will not carry through either. So this assumes that in the process of creating a resource record and in planning your collection processing, that you're going to have a project plan, a processing plan, something like that, that accounts for all of those things. So just something to be aware of. Our metadata rights declaration did carry through. And then our content description So our basic level scope and content note carried through as the scope and contents note, as did the physical description. So some things that didn't carry through were the disposition, the provenance note, a number of other things that did appear in that accession record. So be aware what carries through, what doesn't. This means also that some things you've got kind of your starting point for all of them. So let's get started on actually filling in this resource record. So our title carried through. We already assigned our identifier in talking about that process. We've chosen a level of description of collection. These are, the general types of levels of description that we use in archives. It's good old, remember the name, Oliver Wendell Holmes and the Levels of Archival Description from 1935 tells us what our levels are. So we recall that this accession had both access and use restrictions, so that applies. And then we've got our languages that already came through, and extents that also came through. Now we'll account for agents. The required agent for a DAX compliant description is the creators, Tomi Arai and Ligan Wong. And sorry, I'm not pronouncing those fully correctly. So those came through as creators. So here's one creator, here's another creator. This is the donor. And then the three organizations that are subjects in the collection. One thing to be aware of when you have agents that are subjects, sometimes you need to add a term or a subdivision. So I think this is still a term, current LC term. So if a lot of the collection documents the physical reality of the basement workshop, you might add that as a subdivision. The way this lays out in the interface, I often find with my staff that it's a little bit confusing to understand that this is how, this is going to result in that basement workshop -- homes and haunts. We'll take that back out because we don't actually want it there. Okay, so DAX requires just 2 additional notes since our subjects carried through. So this scope and content note carried through, but it is a starter scope and content. So in my off-screen separate oven, I have the completed resource record with the full scope and content note. So I'm going to go get that. Try to. A full scope and content note is always important as the why. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and overwrite. Ooh, I thought I was going to overwrite. Bear with me a moment. As the thing that worked before is not working. There we go. Hopefully we can all agree that this is preferable to watching me type. Maybe not. Okay, so the full scope and content. And again, this is not a requirement. If the scope and content note, again, referring to those accessioning best practices and the idea that accessioning can be this very robust process, it is entirely possible that you create a full scope and content note in the process of accessioning. The piece that we also need to account for is conditions governing use. And we're going to add that. Well, we'll do conditions governing access. So this is a donor university imposed access restriction. And we're going to go ahead and check publish for that because that is the sort of thing that we want to have visible. And we'll just do a save as an interim measure. Hope that we will. Okay, and we managed to leave out a couple of things. As Rachel said, that's always instructive. So one of the things that is required when you do a resource record is to account for the language and script of description. This is another thing that has come to us over recent years. And one thing that you'll note in this drop-down list is that Old English always comes up first. I will show you later. Latin script in English. I will show you later how to make that different in your drop-down list. So there's the beginning of our resource record. So we've got conditions governing access. We need to do conditions governing use. Remembering that the difference between those two things, according to DAX, is conditions governing access means, can I get access to the materials at all? Conditions governing use is things like, once I have access to the materials, how can I use them? So in this case, the materials we might put the end of the copyright if that is known. Of course, if the creator is still living, we don't know when their death date is going to be. Even though we're good at time travel, we're not that. All right. So that gets us to a basically DAX compliant resource record. An optimal record has a biographical historical note, I cannot copy and paste. We'll put that in as a placeholder. The other thing that we can take a look at is subject terms. Put in a few of the available subject terms. But there are also a number of other possibilities. Because this collection contains, it's the work of artists, some form and genre terms are going to be important to this. So we add a subject. So we've got watercolors, paintings. So these are so those genre terms that come in from, I believe, the Art and Architecture Thesaurus. And it won't search if you misspell it. And let's just confirm where these are coming from. Anyway, so we have added a couple of those terms. So if you're going to use ArchivesSpace to manage containers or locations and want that information connected to your resource records, you'll also want to add instances. Because Dan is going to cover that in multi-level description, I'm not going to cover that here. So that's most of the basics of creating a single level resource record. Depending on how you use ArchivesSpace, especially if you're exporting it in some form, you'll also want to finish the finding aid data section. Again, the language and script of the description are the only parts. The EAD ID, if you assign a durable identifier using the ARC schema, this is where you would assign that. Again, most relevant if you export to something. The finding aid title this is a very optional field, and it really depends on how you present your finding aids, but usually whether you use a subtitle, filing titles, that's all very that's going to be depending on your institution practices. Finding a date. Keeping track of who authors what can actually be helpful to yourself, to your colleagues. When it's evaluation time, these are exposed in the search interface, and you can search up all of the finding aids that you've done over the last year or whatever. So it's kind of worth doing. It's also a place where if you revise a finding aid, you can still acknowledge the original author and then also the author of the most recent update. So we have used Describing Archives, a content standard. And then these are places where you can acknowledge sponsors, edition statements, any other things. Finding aid status. Completed, again, can be a handy way of tracking the work. That depends on whether you're using ArchivesSpace to track work, or if you have some other place like a project management system to track when things are completed. If you are doing that some other place, you don't have to use that. A revision statement is only added if you come back to a finding aid and revise it after it all is already completed and published. Again, that's your repository practice. You're going to document what you do and follow your documented practice. So we're going to save the resource. And along with getting the happy green it's updated and nothing went wrong message, pause to admire it for just a moment, because there's some work that you have completed. Now, I want to show you two more things that will help you avoid, for instance, typing a general access statement over and over by entering default values into a resource record. So this helps make work less tedious, but also more consistent. If your standard practice as an institution, so if most collections are open and you do a statement that's something like collection is open for research, then you can just have that appear as a default value. But first, we have to change a setting. This is covered in a lot of detail in recordings and some of the documentation. So this is just one possibility of how you might do this. But if we go to repository preferences and check off pre-populate records, and then save that particular preference, we're now going to go back to home. And we're going to add a default value for our resource record. So that means browse, resources. And then we're going to go to this handy little piece, edit default values. And you can do this for both resources and resource components. So you could say that every new resource record that you create is going to say conditions governing access. You want that to appear in every record that you create. And then you could add prompts. You could remind people and put in little tips to remind people how you want things done. Always enter both date expression and normalized versions. Okay, so if we save that, now when I go to create a resource record, and that didn't work. Well, there is a recording of adding those default values where it did work. So I'm going to have to refer you to that. So a default value will apply only to a new resource record that you're creating. It's not going to change any of the existing resource records that are already there. And if you put in a default value, it's not carved in stone. You just take it out if it doesn't apply to the record that you are creating. All right. In a related matter, if you have the right level of permissions, you can change controlled value lists to make the data entry faster and to constrain choices appropriately so that the data is more consistent. One of the things that we see once we start describing archives in various systems is we have the ability to be much more consistent. We also have the ability to make things just as inconsistent as they were before we used the system. So you can shape that behavior by making some things defaults or putting them at the top of the list. So if you go to Manage Control Value List, so let's choose something that's related to resource records. So extents. So right now, this list appears in alphabetical order, which is a perfectly reasonable place. But let's say that 90% of our collection description is done in linear feet. There's a couple of things that we can do here. One is to set linear feet as a default, and that's a perfectly acceptable way to do that. Okay, so now the default check appears. Now, hopefully, this works better than the other thing. Haha, linear feet appears as the default. You can also, in those controlled value lists, modify the order that these things come in. So extent type. If you just want linear feet to appear first in the list, in addition to being the default or instead of being the default, kind of overkill to do both actually, you can just change its position in the list. Suppressing certain types is also possible. You can merge these types once you have them set. You can, in most cases, delete them, though if you have things related to it, it may not let you delete that. That depends a little bit on how your system is set up. So let's go back to create a resource record. And we're going to look at extents. Haha, it's both set to linear feet as a default, and that appears at the top. So the way that I use this in my repository is we have certain things, I set linear feet as a default. There are certain things that appear at the top of the list. And then for non-textual materials, we have a drop-down list for instance management of normalized terms from the Art and Architecture thesaurus. And I have moved those all up so that those appear near the top. So that really helps us with being doing much more consistent data entry. So once you have those resource records, they will appear, and you have published them, they will appear in the public interface, which I can now actually use. So there's one of the other collections that is in this, and this is how this now appears. And this is a full level of hierarchical descriptions. So that is it for single level resource records. Now I'll turn it over to Dan, who will expand your knowledge to multi-level resource records.
Actually, I'm gonna go next and then hand it off to Dan.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Okay. All right, thanks, Jody. So now we're gonna build off what Jody just talked about and move into what we call multi-level resource records. And by that, we mean hierarchy in our resource record. So this could mean a collection that contains series, and possibly within series, you might have individual files, but it could also go multiple levels down. So there's a lot of options that we're just going to kind of show you what's available to you. ArchivesSpace employs the principle of inheritance, by which we mean that information present at one level carries forward as you descend down the hierarchy. So I'm going to open up this test record because I wanted to change a bunch of things. So right now, it's what we call a collection level record, similar to what Jody had created just beforehand. So if we go down to the notes, you'll see there's a conditions governing access note stating that these materials are open without restrictions. And so because this is at the collection level, if and when I create series, I do not have to repeat this same information telling you that series 1 is open and series 2 is open. They are inheriting from this collection level. So that's what we mean. That said, I might want to talk about something more generally at the collection level and then get into more detail as we go down into the series and get really more specific. So here is a scope note that's at the collection level, and it kind of describes the collection as a whole. But maybe within each individual series, we want to add specificity. So it might make sense to create a series level scope note that just talks about that particular part of the collection. I'm going to use some terminology to describe intellectual hierarchy that might sound a little bit odd at first, but I'd like to explain how I'm using them. So you're going to hear me say parent, child, and sibling when I'm describing hierarchy. A parent is the level above, a child is the level below, and a sibling is the same level. So you can think of it a little bit like a family tree, if that's helpful. And hopefully as we go through this section and like actually do it, those terms will become more understandable. Just a note that I'm just going to be talking about intellectual hierarchy right now. But after I finish this section, Dan is going to talk about instances and containers. And this is where we can convey information about like the actual physical material and where it is and how much there is in that way. And so that's where we get into like the nuts and bolts of like boxes and folders, for example. So don't worry, we will definitely get into that stuff as well. But for the next few minutes or so, we're going to stay in sort of a more conceptual headspace. How deep you make your hierarchy is really up to you. You can create subseries within series or even sub-subseries. You can also nest individual archival components under each other. This could be potentially useful if you maybe have materials from an event where you have both like paper materials and a video recording, but that's just one use case, and I'll kind of show you a few examples of each of those things. That said, if you export your resource records as EAD files, just be mindful about how deep you create your hierarchy, as I believe EAD can only go up to 12 levels deep. So I'm going to open up this sort of mock record for the Jode family papers. And I'm going to show you how you create levels of hierarchy. So right now it's a single level record. So you can see up in this top window, what's highlighted in blue. That's all there is. There's nothing else in the record at this point in time. But let's maybe imagine that we have processed the collection or processed it further than it had been previously. And so now we want to indicate the different parts of the collection, as well as some individual folders and items. So the first thing we're going to do is create a few series. So to create a series, I'm going to select this Add Child button. And you can already see up here in the top in blue that this new object is going to be sort of like nested underneath the collection title. So we're going to say this is series 1, Oklahoma Family Papers. And so I want a title, and I can tell from this red asterisk that a level of description is required. And Jody already explained what those are. So I'm going to say that this is a series. That's all I need. I might decide I want to add something like a date. I might eventually want to add a series level scope note. That's sort of up to you and your institutional practices. But for the sake of sort of expediency, I'm not going to do those things right now. I want to create a few other series too. So I could either click this Save Archival Object button, or if I want to create another object at the very same level, I could do this +1. So that means save and make another. So I'm going to do that. And you can see that my first series is saved and it's prompting me to create another. So I'm going to say series 2 is, what did I call it? Let's see. I think I'm calling it Great Depression Migration. It's also a series. And I'm just going to save this one. So now I have my 2 series underneath the collection level. Let's say I want to create a 3rd series. So when I look at the top, where what's highlighted in blue kind of orients me within the record. So because I'm at this level and I want to create another series at the same level, I'm going to select Add Sibling. So this is series 3, Jode Labor Organizing Papers. Okay, so those are my 3 series right now. If I wanted to add subseries, I do that the same way. So let's go back to series 2, and I want to create subseries. I'm going to select Add Child. So I'm going to say this is subseries A, Route 66 Migration. I'm going to say it's a subseries, and then I'm going to use this +1 again because I'm just doing the same level. And okay. So to be clear, you do not have to create series. You don't have to create subseries if you don't want to, or if they don't serve your collections or your users. But oftentimes you do want to do some sort of arrangement when processing collections. And so this is one of the ways that you can create that hierarchy. But right now, all we've done is create that structure or arrangement for our collection. So now that we have our series or these discrete parts of the collection, we want to indicate what kinds of items are inside of those series. So we're just going to do a little bit of that in the first series about the Jode family while they were still living in Oklahoma. So I did that really quickly, actually, sorry. I'm just going to navigate back up to this series 1, Oklahoma Papers. You can always tell where you are in the record a few different ways. In this top window, where you are is going to be highlighted in blue. And then also below in the kind of bottom half of the screen is that record is going to be brought up for you. You can always return to the top of the record either by clicking that place in the hierarchy, or right up here kind of at the top, there's like a little breadcrumb trail. So you could always click back to the name for the collection if you kind of wanted to go back to the beginning, although that does close the record, but you can always kind of find where you are. But I want to add things to series 1. So I am going to manually create a few different files. So I'm going to do that by navigating to that series and selecting Add Child. And then I'm going to use the Save +1 option because I'm going to do a bunch. So we have photographs. And I'm going to say these are all files, but you can do whatever you want. I'm going to create some dates, but you do not have to. And I probably will not do dates for the rest of them just because watching someone type is not particularly interesting and takes longer than you think. So just sort of use your imagination of what that might look like. Okay, and the last one. Okay. So those are a few different, more specific parts of the collection under series 1. We're also going to add a few under subseries B in series 2. So I'm going to navigate to that section and do Add Child again. So these are a few parts of that subseries. And okay. So like I said, for each of these, I used the level file, but I'm just going to open up this drop-down list. You could select a different option for you if that made sense. So you might want to choose item, for example. That's sort of up to your institutional practice. So yeah, that is sort of the general how you create intellectual hierarchy. But like I said, we've only talked about the collection and what's inside of it in an abstract sense. We haven't done anything to indicate what box something is in, for example, but we will get to that in a moment. You can also create hierarchy without making series or subseries if you want. So this is definitely something that you will want to make local decisions about, but I want to show you that it is possible. So let's go back up to series 1 to these photographs. So let's imagine that you have photographs in different formats and you not only want to house them separately, but you also maybe want to differentiate them quite clearly. Maybe you have different sort of workflows or protocols for them, and doing so is helpful in a lot of ways. So something that you can potentially do is use nested archival objects to make those distinctions really clearly. So I have this photographs component highlighted. So what I might want to do is say add child. And I might say that we have photographic prints. And I might also say that we also have contact sheets. And then in addition to that, we also have digital photographs. So you can kind of see right here that there are these 3 different kind of versions under photographs. So that's just another way that you can potentially use hierarchy and this functionality in your workflow. So it's just something to consider. So what do you do if you've maybe created an object record at a level or a place in the hierarchy that you maybe didn't intend by accident? If you have done that, you want to use this reorder mode. So at the top, this leftmost button, enable reorder mode, you just want to click that. And that's how you will move you'll move things to like their appropriate place. So let's say, for example, this correspondence, I didn't mean to put it in series 1. I actually meant to put it in series 3. You want to highlight it. And then over here, you have 3 options. You can say drop before, drop as child, or drop after. You just want to select which version or which option you actually want here. So I'm going to say, I actually want to drop it as a child. So I'm going to say drop as a child in series 3. Maybe that's where I actually meant for it to be. And so it moves it to that place. This can sometimes be a lot of work if you're moving a lot of things, so just something to keep in mind. But it is quite handy, so I'm going to disable that now. So far, everything that we've done to create hierarchy and to create these nested items is manual. The next thing I'd like to show is called rapid data entry, which allows you to create a lot of archival objects at the same time. So I'm going to do this in this series 3. So I'm going to navigate there, and I'm going to open up this rapid data entry area. This is functionality that some users really love, while others prefer not to use it at all. So I'm just going to show you it and sort of quickly, but there are definitely tutorial videos, and then you can decide if it's something you want to explore further. And it's sort of like spreadsheet adjacent in that it creates rows and has columns, although there is definitely some more robust spreadsheet tools that we will get into in a moment about data imports. But this gives you kind of some of that ability, and you can also create and save different templates, which can be helpful, especially if you are working with maybe some student workers or volunteers to do inventorying work. You can also get rid of a bunch of these columns. This is sort of like everything that's available to you, but it's probably more than you're going to use all the time. So if you open up this columns section, you can deselect anything that you know you're not actually going to be using. So I'm going to get rid of a lot of these. because I don't intend to use them, but also just because it's really, it would be very difficult for you to actually see what I'm doing with them all there. But know that they are available to you, and depending on what you want to do, you might want to keep more of them, but I'm just gonna get rid of a lot. Oops. So you can see as I'm deselecting, this interface is becoming a little bit more easy to see and easy to work with. So here we go. So you can also make certain columns sticky, by which we mean that the information in that column will show up by default in the next row. So that's what the ones that are highlighted in blue are going to be. So let's, for example, say like my dates are going to be different every time, but the level is going to be the same, and the date type is going to be the same, or maybe the label will definitely be the same. So I'm just going to do a couple of these pretty quickly to give you the idea. And we're going to say, I do have one instance already attached to this record because I knew we were not going to go into it for another minute or two, but I wanted to be able to create that, so don't worry. So you can see I created one item and then I selected add row, and the columns that are in blue carried forward. So we're just going to do a couple more now. And let's say that now I do know that all of the next dates for all the upcoming ones are the same, so I can make those sticky again. And you'll see when I created this new row, now they follow through. So just a few more. Okay, so before you save, I would recommend that you use this validate rows option, just in case there's an error. It's going to check that you have all the required elements. I'd also recommend that if you do end up using this functionality, that you save early and save often. There's no autosave feature in ArchivesSpace, and it would be a real shame if you used rapid data entry to create, hundreds of rows, and then you accidentally like closed your tab or went to lunch and got timed out. So save early, save often. Something related to this is that ArchivesSpace works under the first save wins principle. So if you and another user are both trying to edit a record at the same time, the first person who attempts to save will have their changes reflected. So with all of that said and done, I'm going to hit save. And depending on how many, oops, oh, this didn't have date types, that's why. Depending on how many rows you have, it might take longer to do it or not. But now you can see that, these kind of files, which I created manually, are now created a lot more quickly. Before we dig into instances and containers, I do want to show you just kind of quickly what is perhaps the most popular way to get a lot of information and this kind of inventory information into ArchivesSpace. I won't fully demonstrate it because we're just getting our feet under ourselves in this session, but I want to make you aware of it. It's called Load via Spreadsheet, and it is this button up here in this menu bar. To use this, you need to already have a collection level record in ArchivesSpace, and you need to have something either in this EAD ID field, or you need to be able to point to a URI. I'll show you where that corresponds to in a second. You also need to use a specific spreadsheet template. So the way you can get to those is under the gear icon, bulk import templates, and there are a bunch here. If you're interested in learning more about all these templates and using bulk functionality to import or edit data, we will be doing a training session specifically on this in April. So if that's something you would like to really dig into, there's more on it. In order to create multiple archival objects within a resource record, what you want is this bulk import AO spreadsheet, the ones that I've highlighted. There's two format options. One's a CSV and the other is an Excel file. And which one you use is sort of up to your preferences and which software you have, but you could use either. But yeah, I don't want to, we don't have time to get into them too much, but I just wanted to clarify that these are the ones you will use for kind of straightforward inventorying, but there's a very similarly named one called bulk import DO directly below it. So AO means archival object, DO is for digital object. So you'll download your spreadsheet from here, and I'm just gonna pull up one that I've already mocked up, and I'll try and make it a little bigger. This is sort of what it looks like. Please don't be overwhelmed, even though it's a little overwhelming. What you are seeing is every field, every subrecord, every note with kind of multiple options for each that are available to you. You do not have to use every single part of this, but it's sort of what's available to you. I would recommend that if you're using this, especially for the first time or so, that you just spend some time familiarizing yourself with it. You can definitely hide columns that you're not going to use. So for example, if you are never going to add information about the component unique identifier field, you can hide that column. If you're not going to do anything with these notes, you can hide these. But just make sure that you're hiding them, that you're not deleting them. If you delete columns in here, ArchivesSpace won't know how to map your data and it won't import, or it won't import correctly. So the first few times that you use this, you might get errors, but please stick with it because once you get the hang of it, you will use it all the time. You can create such a volume of records, including records at different levels. So that's something that you can't do in rapid data entry. You can kind of only create at a single level, but in here, I can create a series and files within the series. I can create a different series and then files under them. So you have a lot more flexibility in that regard. So here I'm creating 2 new series for this collection. And then something I'm also doing is using those nested archival objects to do what I did manually, but in a quicker way. So just finishing this section up, and then I'll hand it over to Dan. You want to navigate to your resource record and click load via spreadsheet. I would strongly recommend that you select this only validate button before you try and run your import. Just, if there's any errors, that's going to catch it. And then you want to make sure that you've selected the right option. So we are doing this first one on the left, import archival objects. We're not working with digital objects or linking top containers. So I'm selecting my file. And I'm going to say import from spreadsheet. And this is going to run as a background job, which I know we didn't cover, but this is sort of the way that you either import or export data. And it'll kind of give you a status update of everything that's happened, or if you got an error, it would tell you. But my job is finished, so I'm going to say refresh page. And then if we go back to our record, we can see that these new series, series 4 and series 5, have been created for us without having to do it manually. And even this, this nesting of the photographs, I was able to do without having to do it manually. So yeah, it's super helpful. It's super useful. If you run into problems, the listserv is a really useful resource on that front. And so with that, I am going to hand things over to Dan, who is going to explain instances and containers for us.
All right, thanks, Rachel. since I haven't actually talked because my other two co-presenters did all the hard work, just to let you know, I'm the, as I said, collections archivist at Smith College, and I'm also a past chair of the User Advisory Council and for ArchivesSpace, and then also currently, and also former co-chair of Technical Subcommittee for DAX, and I'm currently the co-chair for the Standards Committee. Okay, so this is one of my favorite aspects of ArchivesSpace. We're going to start, let's define our terms. So for instances, there are two types of instances: container or physical and digital. Digital instances are conceptually similar to container instances, but the implementation is different. We're only going to talk about physical instances today. There is a separate digital objects training that covers it. So let me share my screen. I have much less interesting looking examples. So broadly speaking, a container instance is the physical thing that you are describing, in contrast to the intellectual thing that is the resource, archival object, or accession. So in this example, there's something about Bill's birthday party, but the actual instance is, that's the intellectual part. The actual instance covering physical is that it's in box one. So in short, an instance tells you where the material being described is. Now, an additional functionality of instances, although not nearly as widely adopted, is to distinguish between different material types. So instead of creating multiple archival objects to describe a physical letter, a microfilm version of the letter, and the digitized letter, you can distinguish them with instances. If I move this bar out of my way, I can show you. So here we have the digitized letter from John Smith to Jane Smith, and then the text of it is in box one, and then there's a microfilm version in box two. All right, top containers. So a top container is the largest container that you are managing. The simplest example is a box on a shelf. If somebody needs to look at the material in a box, you go get the box or top container from the shelf, which is the location. The key point here is that the top container can be retrieved on its own while the location doesn't move. So an example that frequently trips people up is a flat file folder in a drawer. In this case, the flat file folder is your top container. The drawer is the location, unless you take the drawer out of the flat file case every time you need to retrieve a folder. Now, I'm sure you all have cases of a collection where everything fits nicely into standard boxes, except there's that one annoying poster or map that needs an oversized box. One of the underrated features of top containers in ArchivesSpace is that they are independent of resources. In some systems, like Archivist Toolkit, a container only exists as a subset of a given resource. In contrast, ArchivesSpace lets you have a single top container linked to multiple resources or components of resources. What's great about this is it means you can easily manage things like having a box that contains materials from multiple collections. So let's create an instance. Now I'll be using archival object records for my examples, but it works exactly the same with resources and accession records. You go down to the instances section, which is conveniently located at the bottom of the page, and click Add Container Instance. There's only two required elements to a container instance. The first is type. This pulls from a controlled value list that can be modified. Depending on your workflow about how much detail you put into things, you may want to set your default value to be mixed materials, like Jody showed you, if that's how you, if you don't generally distinguish by type in your instance. Now, the second mandatory element is the top container. I'm going to show you how to create top containers in a moment, but if you already have a top container linked anywhere in this resource record, you can simply type it into the field and select it. You can also click the down arrow and select Browse. Now, this pre-populates with the current resource. So if you have a whole bunch of like really messy container data and you're having trouble finding a specific box, this is helpful. And it's also how you can find, or you can link to a top container an existing resource. So there's a few ways to do this. The way we set things up here at Smith is every shared container gets a unique number. So like CA shared 15. So that means I can just remove this because I don't want to search in this resource. Go up to keyword and then type in CA shared 15. If you have a lot of top containers, quotes helps keep it from being a really slow search. Search, and you can see it showed up. It shows me also what it's currently linked to. So I can click select that, click link, and now it's replaced that box 1 that I first did. You can only have one top container. So if you need to have multiple boxes that you're describing, the material that you're describing is in multiple boxes, you can just add another container instance, select whatever it is, box 2. There's no limit to how many. You can have a lot. We have very, very many on some of our old things. And that's it for a minimum basic case that you may be done. Now, you may also, though, have a case like, well, it's not just a box. It is, it's got folders in it. So going back to the container instance, still whatever it is, doesn't matter for our example, box 1. So if you have numbered folders that you want to describe, for example, the folder is the child type. So, or the child. The child type would be, in this case, folder. Now, this pulls from a controlled value list that is customizable, but it's a common list with the top container type, which I'll get to later. So folder, so your indicator would be your folder number. If you have a range, you can do a range. You can list them out, whatever you want. If you're one of the rare institutions that barcodes folders, go ahead and put that barcode there. But what if you also have you actually have individually numbered items in a folder that you want to describe? That makes the item a grandchild container. Now, I know an item isn't technically a container, but it functions as the controllable thing. So this works the same as the child container, except there's no barcode option because nobody barcodes at that level. I'm sure somebody does. So there's your instances. But where'd that top container come from? Let's make one. So exit this. So on the same dropdown where you could do the browse, you select create. So container profiles are an optional way to provide size information in order to support collection management and take advantage of either the extent or space calculators. It's also nice to know if you're going to get a box, whether it's tiny or will need like a whole team of people to move it. So if you have a container profile, you can just type it in, select it, or you can use the browse to narrow it down by dimensions, which is nice. But let's create one. So container profiles need a name. So let's just say tall documents. You can put in a link to where you buy it or whatever else you want. Your dimension units, presumably inches or centimeters, and you would want to set the default value as appropriate and never have to touch it again. However, if you measure your containers in yards or meters, you must have a really, really interesting storage system. Like, please contact me after the training. I'd really love to hear about it. What's important is these are not what the extent calculator will output in. That is, it's set in your config file. So it will convert whatever you want your output to be. And the extent dimension, that only matters if you're using linear measurements. And so it just tells the extent calculator, the extent calculator, which dimension, presumably width, that you want to measure. You want the measurement to be on. And then you have your actual measurements, so just 15 10, that's not very tall, 15, 8. You can add a stacking limit. That'll help with the space calculator. Be like, don't stack it any higher than this, even if there's space on the shelf, if you're using the space calculator. And then there's a note field for whatever else you might want. So I just create and link. And now I'm back to the top container with this new document box. So container type, what is it? Is it a box? Is it a folder? This is going to pull from that same shared value list, or control value list, rather, we saw with the child and grandchild containers. Then you have your indicator, which is usually a number. Barcodes are great. Top container barcodes are unique for good reason. And if you have the time to put into barcoding your boxes, you will not regret it, especially if you have a lot of boxes. I don't have a barcode reader hooked up, and while you can type a barcode in, it is not advisable if you don't want to get carpal tunnel. The ILS holding ID can be used if you were associating a top container with a record in an ILS or other external system. This is highly implementation specific, so there's not really anything I can say about that. The internal note is a recent addition to the data model. It does not appear in the PUI and can be used for information specific to the container. We don't use it here, but the common use case I've seen is noting that there is space in a box for more material. And then location management is outside the scope of the basics training, so I'll just note here that you can add a location when creating a top container by clicking add location. You can just type in the location and it'll pop up, create and link. Now saved. And there we have it. That's an overview of instances and top containers. Once you understand the concept of a top container, the actual features, I think, are really straightforward. And I'll now turn it back over to Rachel, who's going to manage the Q&A.
Great, thank you. So now we have a little bit of time for Q&A. I don't see any unanswered questions in the Q&A just right now, but I'm gonna pause and invite anyone who has questions to put them there. And it can be from anything we've talked about today. Okay, someone asked, can resource creation need to have an existing accession record? I think, so the question is, can you create a resource record without it having any related accession? You can. There's no system requirement to having an accession record if you have a resource record, but hopefully we've conveyed to you the value of accessioning and that the accessioning best practices also. But I know that some institutions aren't using that module, so it's not a requirement.
Also add that the terminology ArchivesSpace generally uses is a record is independent. It can exist independently, and then a sub-record would be something that can only exist as part of another record. So anything like an accession or resource, an assessment, digital object, these all can live on their own, although of course they benefit very much from being linked to each other.
Yeah, it's a good addition. Vince asked, since this is recorded, will this be available for replay if I need to review or replay certain areas? Yes, you will get a link to the recording that you can refer to later. Someone asked, is there any way to reorder a lot of archival objects, for example, folder numbers? So think I'm going to answer your question in two different ways, both of which have an answer yes. I'm going to share my screen to do it, I think, most efficiently. I couldn't quite tell exactly which one you meant, but I'm going to address them both. So let's say, for example, you wanted to reorder multiple components within a resource record. So for example, if you wanted to move all of these components into another series, you can do that in the reorder mode by selecting them all. So that's one way to move and reorder multiple objects. But another thing that I thought of as I was reading your question, which might be actually what you're asking, is how to renumber folders for multiple objects in one go. So let's say you've done a rehousing project and you used to have 10 boxes and now you have 20 boxes and the box and folder numbers are all different. If that is what you were asking about, you can also do that with a feature called bulk update or bulk edit. We don't have time to go through it, but you would use this at the collection level, say generate bulk archivable object spreadsheet, which will then give you a spreadsheet of selected components in your record that you can then edit, like in a spreadsheet, re-upload, and then those changes will go into effect. I'm not sure if there's a video up on that yet because it's only just been incorporated into the core code, but maybe someone can either look for it, or if it's not, I'm sure that will be part of the bulk update and edit session in April. Okay, you did renumber, but yeah, that is available, but we don't have time to demonstrate it.
Yeah, I don't believe there is one since it's new in 4.0, which came out like a couple weeks ago. But yes, that will be a big part of the April presentation that I will, or training they'll be doing with someone else whose name escapes me at the moment.
Okay. Maybe just 30 more seconds that we'll wait. These are all really good questions. Okay, going once, going twice. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Jody, who's going to close us up.
All right. So this completes this portion of the basics training. You'll receive as part of, well, I think you already have it as part of the agenda. There is a post-workshop evaluation that is always valuable to the trainers and to the ArchivesSpace organization to understand how we constantly on the trainers team rework our training, and appreciate any feedback that you can give us about that. The course materials are also in the Google Drive, so there's the quick start guide, but also make use, one of you asked about the recording. Certainly make use of the recording, review the portions that you wanted to go over again. But the Help Center is really robust. There's a lot of documentation, a lot of small targeted recordings. Those of us on the trainer core make a lot of those. And they may be 5 minutes, they may be 20 minutes. Always a great way to review the content. It's valuable to come to a training like this to sort of see the big picture, see it all at once, and of course, get your questions answered. But the particular, how do I do this step by step, is fulfilled really well by the documentation and the recordings that are available in the Help Center. So I encourage everyone to make good use of that. And I believe we are done 4 minutes early. Hooray for all of us for getting done just a little early, but not too much. really appreciate everyone's attendance, attention, and patience with the small flubs today. And hope that everyone has a great rest of their day.